Welcome to the lab. This is your host, Coach Jesse Grund, and we are going to talk about your spine today. That's right. That thing that makes us a vertebrate, that thing we need, it sends signals to our body, that thing that when it gets hurt, it feels like it is the most debilitating thing, and that thing that 80% of Americans claim to have pain in, your spine. Now, in today's talk, in this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about the spine, the anatomy of the spine itself. We're going to talk a little bit about all of the anatomy of the musculature on the back of your body, your posterior chain, how it affects the way you move, expectations of movement in the spine, and then I'm going to talk about top 5 ways I like to train the spine itself. So let's get into the spine. So the spine is a series of small joints that have millimeters of movement, both flexion and extension in each joint cascading through the spine. This is a really important thing to remember. The spine doesn't move necessarily just as one unit. When we're moving the spine, we're moving millimeters at a time of segmentation between the vertebrae. Your spine is broken up into 3 parts. We have your cervical spine, your thoracic spine, and then your lumbar spine. And at the base of the lumbar spine, we have some of the sacral lumbar discs, which are when we start getting into the sacrum, which is the connection into the pelvis itself. Now, traditionally speaking, looking at the spine and the standard model of training and rehabilitation has always taught that the thoracic spine is supposed to be where almost all movement of the body occurs, that we want a stable lumbar spine, a cervical spine that has some movement to it, obviously, because it helps us move our head. But primarily speaking, those 12 vertebrae of the thoracic spine, which is the largest section, is supposed to be your primary mover of the spine itself. But as we are growing to understand the spine, we're also growing to understand the fact that segments of the spine need to be able to articulate segment by segment. We don't want the spine to just chunk in its movement in any direction. And we want it to be able to do all of that linear motion first before we ever introduce rotation. So if you actually look at an anatomy, whether it's an app or a poster of the spine itself, you will see that there is quite a bit of muscle. There's quite a bit of red stuff that is surrounding the spine. And when you get to the thoracic spine, some of it is working its way across the body. And that's important to remember because any movement that we see in the body, we want it to be supported by tissue to help it move. Muscles help, they're moving the skeleton, right? We're closing joint angles by shortening muscle, shortening tissue. But it's really important that when we start looking in the spinous processes themselves, that we have all of these little muscles in between each vertebrae. And those muscles help to stimulate blood flow to the space, also create little bits of movement. We call them multifidi. And so when we're looking at the multifidi, as you're working up the spine, that's where some of that articulation, those millimeters of articulation are supposed to occur. So that brings me to one of the points about the standard model of training that we talked about with Grayson this week, which is the spine's supposed to be neutral. And that if you take the lumbar spine, for instance, into flexion, you are going to damage it. The problem with that thought process, though, is the fact that we do that all day long. We bend over to tie our shoes or pick our kids up. Can you imagine if every time you flexed your lumbar spine, which is this segment right here, if every time you did this, it broke every time? Can you imagine being in that place? It doesn't do that because it does have structures associated with it that help it to move, and that those vertebrae, those lumbar vertebrae, should have segments of movement to them. And so when we're looking at the spine as a whole, we want to get away from thinking that the only way we can train it is training it to be neutral all the time. You might have heard that before. Neutral spine. What is that? What is a neutral spine? It doesn't make sense. There isn't a such thing as a neutral spine. We want control of our spine. We want control of our cervical spine. We want control of our thoracic spine and then our lumbar spine. We want to be able to move it under our own control and it not just be this strange apparatus that runs our back up and down. And so that brings me to one of the newest things that's occurring in the health and fitness world, which is the idea that I can train my spine and the associated structures to be strong, which is something that we want to do. Now, just like with anything else, we have to start somewhere, and that usually starts with some sort of proper assessment to get there. But once we do that assessment and we understand where our spine is right now, then we can start using all the ways that we want to train it to then be able to progress that training to a place where it can handle more loads. Because at the end of the day, life has a lot of different loads associated with it, and we want to make sure the loads that we face in life, we have the potential to be able to withstand. So the spine is not this weak and brittle structure. It is a structure that we can train and we can put the inputs into to be able to train it. Now, a couple of my favorite ways to train the spine itself, we start looking at how to train the spine both linearly and in rotation. So first is just basically understanding how to move your spine in space. So just working your spine through flexion and extension is a great way to start. So if we want to look at a spine car, we usually start with just teaching somebody how to actually flex the spine and then be able to extend the spine. Once we teach that and get that resilience, which you see sometimes in cat-cow, which is a position where we go on the ground and we do that, we can then start working to have control of those segments. So that drill I just showed you is very easy to do off of a wall or a rack where you put your back there. There's a variation of it where you can take a ball, you put it right behind your back, and you try and make sure that ball rolls down your spine instead of chunking forward and chunking back. Because I guarantee you the areas that chunk mean that when you try and absorb force in your spine, we only have certain levels of all of those segments where we can absorb force. So way number one, just basically learning how to flex and extend the spine. Now, way number two is to actually take the spine through a spine car. Spine cars are rotation of the body. So when I want to do a spine car, I'm going to flex, and now I want to rotate from flexion, extend, and rotate all the way around. These help create rotation in all of the bioflow that's associated with the spine itself. These are our moving with training wheels on. It's important to remember we want to start moving with training wheels first. So none of this is loaded. I'm working against gravity right now. There's nothing else working on me. Now, way number three, once I'm able to start adding load, is the Jefferson curl, which you've probably seen before. Again, we want to make sure we have control of lumbar flexion before we load lumbar flexion. But when we're doing a Jefferson curl, we're holding some sort of weight or load in front of us. And we're going to curl down and then work on curling back up again. It doesn't have to be heavy, but it will start to train that lumbar spine and the rest of the spine how to articulate in and out of extension. Now, once I've addressed all the linear elements of the spine itself, then I can start working into the transverse elements of the thoracic spine. Because if I don't understand how to work the linear elements of my spine, I won't understand how to segment that thoracic spine only without there being some accommodation from the lumbar spine. So then we can start working into thoracic rotations. So a really easy thoracic rotation is just to go into a tall kneeling position, take your right hand, bring it behind your back, and just try and open that chest up towards the ceiling. And now I'm starting to get into my thoracic spine and learn how to control that, which is really, really important. Now, finally, and one of my favorite ways to actually train the spine is to add gravity as a greater load. And a really easy object to do that with is a pull-up bar, and actually learn how to segment that lumbar spine all the way up and all the way down. So I'm actually working from lumbar into flexion and then into extension again. But now I've added an element of hanging to it as I do that. We treat the lumbar spine as this brittle entity that is just gonna break whenever I move it. But it has structures associated with it that we can train. And as long as we're considering the whole system, we know where our start point is, we know where we're working towards. We can take the spine as a whole and start to be able to create this strong engine that allows us to move and stay more resilient in life.